I want to thank everybody for coming. This is exciting. And we're super grateful to our guests today, which I'm going to get into in just a moment. Antiracist Electoral Action is a grassroots organization that aims to accelerate anti-racist progress by increasing awareness about the importance of electoral politics at every level of governance. Tonight's event is the first of what we hope will be many forums to come, where we will be discussing and strategizing anti-racist electoral politics at the local, state, and federal level. In doing so, we hope to empower voters to make the best use of the ballot box alongside other tools of anti-racist change. We're interested in talking with people who not only denounce bigotry, but who are working to root out systemic racism that creates and perpetuates racial inequality. Anti-Racist Electoral Action is not committed to any political party, only political principles and action. Our 4 founding members are here tonight. Andy Shalal, you want to say hi? There he is. Andrea Benjamin, Sekou Franklin, and myself, Tehama Lopez Bunyasi. Although we wear many hats in our individual lives, our work with Anti-Racist Electoral Action is in our capacity as private citizens, and our views are our own. Also, the views of our guests tonight belong to them alone. We're grateful to have as our guests tonight 2 congressional candidates running for the U.S. House of Representatives, Jeannine Lee Lake from Indiana's 6th Congressional District and Qasim Rashid from Virginia's 1st Congressional District. We welcome both of you. Tonight's theme is protesting and voting, anti-racist necessities. When planning tonight, we wanted to speak to people who are engaging the power of the ballot and also the power of non-electoral politics, such as demonstrations and protests. The candidates with us today caught our attention because they have spoken clearly against racism in many forms and have participated in protest politics and different forms of advocacy this summer and years prior. Mrs. Lake, to jump right in, let us first ask, what are you doing as a candidate to promote anti-racism? Oh, hold on, we need to unmute you. We need to unmute Mr. Rashid as well. Can you do that, Andrea?
I think, am I unmuted now? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, yep. Great. Well, I'm running in Indiana's 6th Congressional District, and my opponent is Greg Pence, the Vice President's brother. So I am up against, I think an administration, I say, that doesn't seem to value racial equality issues in the way that myself and literally tens of thousands of people that have come out for various racial equality events. Ever since George Floyd's death, throughout this whole summer, I've gone to maybe 40 plus events, all peaceful, 100% across the board, no arrests, no vandalism, no riots. In the 6th district here, we have over 700,000 people, almost 800,000 people. And we have had a season of just really good activism that has transformed it even into, I'm sitting outside of City Hall in Muncie, where the Muncie Police Department has enforced and engaged with the community to be able to have some wonderful new initiatives with regards to their use of force policies. They have over 80 use of force policies, and they are now committed to changing those every single year and to revising and reviewing those every single year with our new police chief, Nate Sloan. So we've seen a lot of good things in Indiana this year.
That's excellent. Thank you. And Mr. Rashid, what are you doing as a candidate to promote anti-racism?
Well, thank you for having us here. It's such a privilege to share this platform with my colleague Jeannine, and wish you the best of luck in your race. And I think for me, this is really about running for office based on the work you've already done. I think we've seen so many politicians kind of show up and say, hey, if you vote for me, I promise to do these 11 different things. What I'm grateful for is that I've been able to build partnerships with law enforcement, partnerships with the folks who work in the prison systems, partnerships with Commonwealth attorneys to actively root out unjust policies and work on building a more just, compassionate, and empathetic approach to combating racism that doesn't involve police violence, or doesn't involve in discrimination. Just this morning, I was sitting with a police chief talking about logical and common sense ways to respond to 911 calls that don't involve use of violence, and recognizing the need to recruit, not from a sake of diversity, but from a sake of meaningful representation. I echo my colleagues' really eloquent remarks about being present. You know, attended dozens of events, but again, you know, and I think if we look at her track record, we'll find the same thing, that we didn't start attending these events post George Floyd, right? This is the work we've been doing for a long time. And we're running for office now because we realize that as activists, we still can't change the systemic issues and policies that are harming people of color, particularly Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, and certainly Native Americans. And so this is really about taking the work and the relationships we've built, combating racism, and transforming that advocacy into policy so that when we are in the halls of Congress, we can take the knowledge and experience we've learned from being in the trenches and making them into better policy. One of my favorite quotes and pieces of wisdom is from Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who says beautifully that the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And I think you see a Black woman, a brown immigrant running for Congress. We're trying to be representative of who America is, of what America stands for, to ensure that the policies that we implement going forward are actively anti-racist and uphold justice with a positive piece, rather than what Dr. King talks about, a negative piece, which is just the presence of tension.
That's wonderful. Ms. Lake, go ahead. You want
If I could add, kind of like build on what you guys have been talking about, I know that this administration and probably a lot of the people you're running against are running on a law and order kind of idea, right? That's the big thing now, right? Law and order. A lot of people in the progressive in the progressive movement are talking about defunding the police, issues that I think are important. And yet that issue of defunding the police has been used as a tool against candidates like yourselves. Are you guys, how are you guys navigating the issue of defunding the police when so many progressives are calling for that? And it's obviously not just to take money away from police and do nothing with it, but actually divert some money into social services and things that police really have no business dealing with to begin with. So how are you guys dealing with that kind of narrative and channeling it in a way that works for your candidacy?
One of the things that I always ask people that bring those kind of initiatives to me is, how are you defining that? Because one of the things that I look at when it comes to reform for police officers, how are we looking at no-knock warrants? How are we looking at strongholds and chokeholds? What does it look like to you in your community when you see the police chief and the officers within the community doing things with community, having liaisons that are willing to sit at the table and have conversations about bringing in social workers, about bringing in pastors, about bringing in other community resources, that may involve some more funding to strengthen and maintain peace and law and order, which everybody wants. I think well, sometimes the opposition will bring something to me and say, what do you think about this or what do you think about that? I was like, you know what? Long before defund the police was out there in the lexicon, we were talking about best practices for our officers here in Muncie, years and years ago, and I really became involved on the local level, the community level, after Trayvon Martin was, in my opinion, murdered. And so I became very actively involved because I have 3 sons, and a daughter that were moving into adulthood at the time, and I was very concerned about them. So, whatever you want to call it, reallocation of funding, bringing in, like I said, other resources to encourage, good law enforcement, and taking responsibility for the fact that, historically, when you look at policing, especially among brown and black people, those agencies have some histories that they need to reconcile. you know, a lot of them started, you know, within the slave communities where if you caught brown and black people, particularly black people, you know, you were rewarded with monetary sums of money. And so you didn't care how you brought them back. As long as you brought them back alive, even if they, you know, were barely alive, that is kind of the thinking that we've had to go from there. And so, you know, I think I don't let people define who I am. I actually, as a PR and a journalism major, I do not like even the phrase defund the police. Not for a minute do I think that we need to defund the police. I think that we need to look at as many options as we can to build and enhance the police. But I don't like that. I don't like that. It's like here in Indiana, they passed a way to get rid of unions, and they called it right to work. And so everybody voted for right to work because it sounded great, but they didn't really realize kind of what was going on. So I think wording has a lot to do with it. I don't let anybody define anything for me. And so I just bring it back to them. What does a good community policing system look like for you? And in the case of in Minneapolis, when they said that for every black man, he was 13 times as likely to be killed by police than a white man in that same city. Now, when you talk about those kind of numbers, to me, defunding the police is definitely on the table, because you cannot have those kind of numbers and think that that system does not have bias in it, inherent bias that will actually end up with lost lives. And so I don't think that goes across the board. But for me, I just, you know, I don't like that phrase. But in some instances, I think it's definitely, you know, you need to start over. Hit the reset button in Minneapolis, start completely over.
I would like to hear, thank you. I would like to hear from Mr. Rashid. When you hear defund the police, you know, how do you understand that? And what is your take on that in translating the things that you think the activists are calling for into some kind of policy?
You know, I read a recent poll that 80% of Americans understand that defund the police doesn't actually mean to abolish the police. So you know, those who are engaging in that rhetoric are doing so in bad faith knowingly, which again harms our communities. Even today, when I was sitting with the police chief, he acknowledged that, yeah, I know defund the police doesn't actually mean to fire me and get rid of my deputies. What I try to focus on, I think what we've done a really effective job in this space is recognizing what a working model looks like. We talk about a proven model. Mark Twain said it best that there's nothing quite as annoying as having to argue with as a proven model. And so we're pointing to Camden, we're pointing to Denver on how we can create a police force that does a couple of really important things. And I start by establishing the principle that what do we want a law enforcement department to do? We want them to stop and prevent violent crime, or if there's a violent crime, to address that. What that means is if we are also requiring them to then handle mental health issues, that's time taken away from preventing violent crime. Addiction issues, that's time taken away from keeping us safe. Homelessness issues, school bullying issues, cats stuck in a tree issues. These are all things that we can agree law enforcement cannot afford to waste when they're tasked with stopping and preventing violent crime. And so then the question is, if we agree that that's what they're trained to do and that's what they should be doing, then why are we burdening them with these 11 other things that we haven't given them the tools or the training or the resources to do? And when you present it that way, then a light bulb goes off and says, oh, well, we actually have mental health professionals that went to college and got training on this particular issue. We have suicide prevention experts that can address and de-escalate a situation. Those are the folks that should be leading these conversations. And if they need police as backup, guess what? They can still call law enforcement as backup. Here in Virginia, a young black man, Marcus Davis Peters, I think 23, 24 years old, a biology teacher, had a mental health episode, was nude and got in a car accident, came out of his car disorientated, and law enforcement shot him dead. He was naked, unarmed, and they shot him dead. Imagine if we had a police department or a community service board that said, we're going to deploy a mental health professional to de-escalate that situation, because anyone who knows the first thing about people suffering from mental illness, they are most dangerous, not to others, but to themselves. And so when we present it that way and say, why aren't we funding our law enforcement in our communities to address the issues that society actually needs? And whenever I presented it that way, even to the most staunch Republicans and right-wing personalities, they agreed that, yeah, that actually makes really good sense. It's just, unfortunately, with media, there's so much name calling and yelling back and forth that I just don't do. But in these one-on-one conversations, we're having a lot of success. And that's, I think, where the narrative needs to go.
Right.
So despite a recent report by the ACLED and the Bridging Divides Initiative at Princeton University that 93% of all demonstrations connected to the BLM movement this summer were peaceful, there are political figures who are adamant about trying to portray these protests and this activity as unlawful, as disorderly, and as even un-American. And we were curious about how, if at all, do you counteract that talking point? Because there's a whole, it seems like there's an entire narrative around that. So how do you engage in that or not engage in that?
Well, I'm so glad that that particular study was done, because I did feel as if the whole law and order concept that this administration was putting forth was taking hold in some regard. But let me just say real quick, and then I'll kind of go back to that. But I thought it was interesting. I went to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and I met with the mayor, John Armentarian, I think is his last name. A wonderful guy. One of the things he told me, without a doubt, was that, first of all,
Let's see. Okay, I think we've lost her for a moment. Mr. Rashid, would you like to take this? How do you get into that conversation with people?
Look, I mean, I think this is why it's so important.
concerned about law and order.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
We switched over to Mr. Rashid because there was a pause.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's all right. I don't know.
You want to finish maybe saying what you had to say, Jeannine? I think that might be easier to follow. Yeah.
Just that when I was in Kenosha, I was able to meet with the mayor, Mayor John Armentarian, I think is his name.
Okay.
Too bad. Okay.
I think your connection might be a little bit weak.
Can you hear me okay?
It's cutting off.
Oh, it's cutting off. Okay, well, Qasim, do you want to go ahead and go? I'll see if maybe this will get back in.
Okay, yep, that'd be great.
All right.
No, I think this is why it's so important for us to be authentic in our narratives and be so forceful in demanding justice as that supreme standard. Look, a couple of months ago, when militia members were storming the Michigan State House with armed rifles, brandishing them, threatening to behead the governor, causing threatening terrorism so severe that they had to shut down the State House. When in Oregon late last year, they did the same thing, and it was found out that members of the GOP had actually conspired with members of this militia for acts of terrorism. That was not applied to all people. That was not applied to anybody but those individuals engaging in those acts of terrorism and those acts of threatening to assassinate our political leaders. But somehow for Black Lives Matter protests, because a couple of individuals completely unrelated to individuals fighting for racial justice engaged in violence, which is of course condemnable, no one is defending that, suddenly the entire BLM movement has to be accountable. I just reject the whole framing of it. I think anytime we fall into this trap of trying to answer for people that don't represent us, I cringe. And so even honestly, even the study that says 93% of them were peaceful, I don't even like citing that study, because I'm not here to prove to you that people who don't represent me don't represent me. I mean, let's just be honest. We need to be able to fight to represent ourselves and push back at the narrative. I mean, I'm an American Muslim in a post 9/11 America. One of the most cringeworthy memes that I'm seeing right now is, I want to be how Americans were, or the best way to honor 9/11 is to remember how we were on 9/12. Well, on 9/12, I got pulled over. My brother was a U.S. Marine and got interrogated, right? As a Marine, I remember how we were on 9/12. It wasn't pretty, right? And the level of hate crimes against Muslims, particularly Black Muslims and Arab Muslims, skyrocketed. So I would push back against these narratives and say, look, 93%, look at how peaceful we are. I would say that the people committing violence don't represent us. We are a movement, we're not a moment. We're focused on racial justice. We're focused on racial equity. You can go back, and I'll make this point just to show how important it is we write our narratives. You can go back and look at the political cartoons made in the 1960s of the great Dr. Martin Luther King. And they were mocking him, a man who is now renowned as the epitome of peace. They were mocking him for the violence that erupted at some of these marches that he had nothing to do with. They ridiculed him and made fun of him. I mean, they killed him, right? So I don't want to get into these conversations about these protests. The riots that are occurring, the only people accountable for them are the ones committing those. No one here is defending those. We need to keep the focus back on the injustices that led to the murder of Breonna Taylor, to the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Tamir Rice, to the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. Those are the injustices that we should be focused on. We can fix broken windows. We can't fix broken necks. We need to keep our focus where it belongs.
Right. That's a talking point right there. Thank you. So we have about 6 minutes left in this time, and I like to know what policies, if you get into Congress, right, what policies are you going to push for that are really going to address and try to undo systemic racism? Mrs. Lake, I think we can hear you now. Can you give it a go? No, we cannot.
Well, she's on mute, but I think if you unmute her.
Okay, I'll try. Go ahead, Mrs. Lake.
Okay, hi there. Yes, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm on a different platform. I apologize
That'll work.
so much for. That's one of the things that I need to push for is broadband in rural areas. You know how that goes. I've been dropped more many times than I can say, but yeah, like
policy.
Yes. Some of the things that we've already mentioned, you know, in terms of police reforms that really must be addressed. One of the things I love today, you know, Breonna Taylor, the city settled with her family for $12 million. One of the interesting things that they put into place was a Homestead Act, which allowed police officers to be able to have benefits and maybe certain incentives to be able to buy homes in the areas with people that they serve. So those kind of initiatives, I mean, those, you know, it can be anything from that to obviously looking at some of the programs that are offered through the law enforcement officials, sentencing issues, arrest issues. I mean, we have to have merit commissions that reflect the populations, and have, you know, people that are not politically motivated on those merit commissions. So I know that, you know, that goes deep down, but we have to at least have more of a proactive nature when it comes to law enforcement and policing of all people. Here in Muncie, unfortunately, you know, I'm in a community where we've had, I think it's up towards 10 lawsuits that have been filed in the last several years against various police officers. This newest batch, I think, isn't going to be heard and adjudicated until February. But you know, we've been suffering here in Muncie, and so you know those things are important to me. I've had a lot of people on not just with African Americans or people of color, but here in Muncie, just across the board. We've had a lot of several lawsuits that have dealt with Caucasian men that have been, you know, have filed against, you know, for civil lawsuits, and then also the FBI is investigated too. So we're actually a community that has really and truly needed these changes. And so those are the type of things that I would be advocating for.
Thank you. Mr. Rashid, policies, anti-racist.
Reparations. I think we have to start with economic justice. And I was watching a beautiful clip of Dr. King just yesterday where he talked about how after 260 years of free labor, Black Americans were told to lift themselves up by their bootstraps, whereas white Europeans who immigrated, got 140 acres with the Homestead Act, free of charge. They got subsidized federal loans, the history of redlining, digital redlining, which is still in effect today, marginalizing Black and brown communities. So Professor Coates has written extensively on reparations, and he argues beautifully, again, that we don't even need to go back to the days of slavery. We can look at Jim Crow, we can look at mass incarceration, we can look at the war on drugs, we can look at redlining, we can look at the discrimination in the education system. There are so many factors. And so I think at the very core, we need to look at economic justice. Once we can build out economic justice and get economic power into the hands of Black and brown communities, particularly Black communities, then we can talk about ensuring we move forward. But right now, since the civil rights era, Black wealth has increased a whopping 1%. 1%. The legislation that was passed has been countered by segregation, by different forms of segregation, by redlining, by, again, the war on drugs and mass incarceration. That needs to be undone with meaningful financial compensation and reform. Representative Conyers has introduced a bill for decades that hasn't even gotten out of committee on just studying reparations, not even giving reparations, but just studying them. We are in such denial about our history that we're not even willing to have an honest conversation about it. So I think once we can get on board and build the critical mass necessary for the economic justice, then other things will fall into place. But right now, we're just not having an honest conversation from a position of equal leverage. And that's why we're continuing to see these Band-Aid solutions fail. Once we can create more economic justice and equity, we're going to start to see some meaningful reform take place, in my view.
Thank you. And Mr. Rashid, I know you have to go soon, but we have one more question that hopefully you can answer quickly, and then we'll go to Mrs. Lake. Our country is in need of more understanding across lines of difference. As Democrats, what stereotypes would you like to dispel about living in and running for office in so-called red districts?
And you have 60 seconds each to do this.
Oh, great. Well, I think that we need to stop worrying about trying to flip voters on issues of human rights and just be bold and progressive in our values, and stop even calling them progressive values, but calling them, humane values. I'll give you one really good example. This is a conservative district historically, and everyone and their mother told me that if you run on Medicare for all, you're not going to win the primary. You're just not going to. Forget about it. And I said, thanks for your opinion. I disagree. And we ran on a unapologetic platform for Medicare for all. Not only did we win the primary, but we won with more votes than any Democrat has ever had in the history of the first district in a primary. So remember, what we're fighting for is to uphold human rights and justice for working families, for marginalized communities. You don't need to apologize for that. You don't need to whitewash that. You need to be bold and confident in that and build the infrastructure to go after that aggressively. And if you do that, I think we'll begin to see the meaningful change that we need to see to return strength and power to the people who are supposed to be represented in government.
Thank you, Mr. Rashid. Mrs. Lake, any stereotypes you'd like to dispel about the so-called red districts?
Oh, there's a couple things that I have to always kind of put out there when I'm trying to meet with Republicans, moderate Republicans, independents. And that's, that I'm a 2A girl. My family has owned weapons. We grew up in the country. We're the Black family in the country. And my dad always had, weapons to protect us if you came out there at 2 o'clock in the morning and, you're just not there to hang out. So, but I'm also a common sense gun candidate. I'm a proponent of the red flag law. We have to make that. We have that here in Indiana, but it'd be wonderful to have it as a federal law. I am, for, just common sense things, locking up your guns, making sure that you're responsible. So those kind of things. I have to always tell people that, I am very patriotic. I have people in my family that have served in the military. My sister-in-law was a 30-year decorated police officer herself. So, I think that they like to put out that we're not true patriots somehow. And so, I hope that people get to know me as a person rather than as, you know, the Democrat, the Black lady that is running for Congress who's a Democrat. And, you know, even my opponent always tries to paint me as this, you know, I mean, quite honestly, I always say Nancy Pelosi, liberal and all this. And I'm like, you know what? I'm me. So get to know me as me. I always, and I'm convinced of this, that once you meet Jeannine Lee Lake, you're going to vote for her, because you know that without a doubt, she is the candidate that is definitely on your side, even if you don't always agree with her on everything, but you know that she's going to fight for you. So those are kind of some of the things that, you know, that I think that we fight against. But I mean, I'm happy to be from Indiana. I love Indiana. You know, we have some challenges just like anybody else, but I think I mentioned at the top that my district is 93% white. I won the primary with over 70% of the vote. And like Qasim said, you know, just be yourself. Don't pretend like you are on the other side, because that's the whole point. I'm for Medicare for all. I want these changes that we talk about. I'm an equality candidate. And let me just end by saying this. I think the coalition and this group is dynamic. I love what you're standing for. I love what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I want to respect the time constraints. I want to thank Mr. Rashid. I want to thank Mrs. Lake for joining us. And we have some words from our fellow members here who would like to announce the next event that we'll have in a couple of weeks.
Sure.
Thank you, Mrs. Lake.
Thank you all so much for joining us. In 2 weeks, on September 29th, we will be hosting a very similar short forum, hearing from women of color that are running for office. So we hope that you'll put it on your calendar and join us in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. And we appreciate you all very much. And God bless you guys.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Pete.